Making a positive change in the world is really part of why people do research in this area, and it really helps to frame the research problems that people tackle and influences how they interact with the world, the stakeholders in research, but and also people across different professions. So working with communities, government and business is really common, but it's still challenging and complex, and it takes time and skill. So with increasing interest in identifying and demonstrating the impact of research, by universities and by government, many are looking to social sciences for the practices that really support effective engagement with users and beneficiaries of research. So today, our panel, I'd like to introduce to you, we have Rebecca Olive, who is Vice-Chancellor's Senior Research Fellow in the School of Global Urban Social Studies at RMIT. And her work is on the role of sport and leisure in the human, ocean, health and well-being, and is connected to communities via media, including websites, blogs, Instagram posts, magazine articles and a podcast. And I'll be putting some links into her work that you can then follow up through the chat. We have Professor Annette Markham, who is a Professor of Media and Communications and the co-director of the Digital Ethnography Research Centre at RMIT. And her research focuses on how digital transformations influence identity formation, personal relationships and organisational practices. And with more than 20 years of expertise in internet studies and digital sociology. So Annette has developed some frameworks and techniques for social scientists to really grapple with the complexity of network culture and digitally saturated social contexts. And also we have Professor Lisa Given, who's a Professor of Information Science and Director of the Social Change Enabling Capability Platform at RMIT. And her research interests include information behaviour of individuals, web usability, user experience of technology, community engagement, and societal impact of research, using qualitative mixed methods research design and also in higher education. So welcome to all of our panel and all of you. And I'll just start off by posing some questions and then getting some comments from the other panelists. So my first question is to you, Annette, to ask you what methods lend themselves to best engaging with non-academic community, industry or government partners.
Thanks everybody for joining us. And it's a very interesting question we begin with. I actually was going to change the question because I didn't really like it very much. And then I realized I think it's a trick question. So I'm going to go ahead and answer it. The question's what methods lend themselves best to engaging with non-academic partners? And my answer is there's no best method. I know that's a simple answer, but good applied research from my perspective is never method driven. It's question driven or problem driven. So instead of thinking about the best methods, we might think about how we can discover a partner's core questions or problems, and then from that derive a study that adopts the most suitable, appropriate, fitting methods for those specific questions. And that requires a flexibly adaptive mindset. Rather than being driven only by my own instincts or strengths or core methods, I'm actually self-help and seeking to help somebody or consult with them. And that's mostly in the case of industry. In the case of communities or cities or maybe even at festivals where I'm working with the public, I might be actually seeking to provoke, maybe even to push against something or to have an activist mindset. So a flexibly adaptive mindset also means understanding the goal of research and then fitting that with the partner and the most appropriate method. And because I seek to be really flexible and adaptive, that means I have to have a really big toolbox of different methods. This year, for example, I've already done a participatory engagement workshop in a public space to help build methods for citizens to build their own social science practices to study their own data, a form of citizen social science. I've also conducted some focus groups to build intensive knowledge around a particular topic for the stakeholder in a company. And then for the Victorian government and the city of Melbourne, I also developed and launched a large-scale citywide survey. Having said that, I guess I find that many external partners don't always know what they need. So they initially think that they need methods and findings that are data-driven or empirical in some way. They want findings that lend themselves to solutions or answers. They want evidence-based protocols. So they don't always recognize that there are more creative and participatory models and tools available. And they don't always recognize that there might be many answers, not just a single finding. And they might need someone like a social scientist to help them find value in exploration and open-ended and inductive methods and creative experimentation and provocative collaborations and participatory models. So again, I think there's no real best method. I think it's about being flexibly adaptive and willing to stretch outside one's comfort zone.
Thanks, Annette. There's a lot in there to unpack, and I think we'll probably come to some of those issues as we go through the questions. I just wanted to give the opportunity for Rebecca or Lisa just to comment on that question and maybe give some of their experiences. Oh, Rebecca, do you want to go first?
Do you want to go, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. 100% yes to everything Annette said. So I'll just add on to that. I use ethnographic methods. So I'm a field worker in cultural communities. And by cultural communities, I mean like swimmers and surfers. So cultural practices and physical activities. And for me, it's also about the building trust and to show them that I'm fully implicated in the research too, that those communities want to know that I'm not just there to take something from them and talk about them like they're a distant group. So again, building on what you said, Annette, because it's got to be relevant to the community itself, the method. So for me, when I design a project that's trying to engage with community, it has to build trust and make it clear that I'm also part of this in a way that implicates me. And I've always found that's really important in the work that I do.
Yeah, I mean, I would just briefly add to that, totally echo what Annette's view was there. And I suppose for me, I think there are sometimes better methods. There may not be the ones that are the best, but there are certainly some that I wouldn't advocate, or where I would, especially when I'm counseling, doctoral students, people who are starting out fresh, who may not have a lot of experience engaging outside of university. Often I find people will immediately say, "Oh, I'll do a survey monkey. I'll send out a survey and we'll find out what people think." And that's not really the best way to capture the concept of engagement. So I think, what both Annette and Rebecca are alluding to is this notion of how do we give voice to people? How do we build relationships? How do we use methods kind of to the best ends for what we want to achieve with a partner or with a community group or whatever it might be. So sometimes that's going to mean really stretching your repertoire of methods. And a lot of people tend to sit just in their own comfortable box. And that comfortable box is often one-on-one interviews and survey design. Certainly in my discipline, we've got research that shows those are the two kind of tried and true that everyone uses. And I'm often trying to kind of stretch people out. So using things like photo voice, giving cameras to participants, letting go of the control as a researcher is often the big leap that a lot of people have to make. But it's one that so many of us that work in a method space are very happy to help with and to counsel people around.
Can I just come back to that? Something that you said, Lisa, and I think it's important to recognize that what you called engagement, that there's something different that is needed when we talk about engagement. I think there's something different when we talk about wanting to do social change, right? Like, so if we want to create social change, we fundamentally, I think, are talking about finding tools that are closer to change rather than simple observation
and get data gathering. And yes, exactly. And that's a change of mindset, right?
Yeah, and it requires a a dip in, well, maybe requires a returning to what is the fundamental purpose or goal of one's research. And if it's no longer to explain or to just understand, but it is to change, then a method is also going to have to be oriented toward change. I think that's often quite difficult for academic researchers trained in remaining neutral observers of society to adopt and adapt to. And I think that's a really important place to think about becoming something like a social activist. And what does that mean for one's orientation to shift from observation to intervention? Anyway, for what it's worth.
Thanks, Annette. I think that's a really important point when people are thinking about training researchers and people thinking about changing their practice, that it is a very fundamental sort of change to, I guess, to what's driving you to do that work. So it kind of leads into a next question for Lisa about what are the ethics related issues when you're engaging with external partners in, I guess, particularly co-created projects and what that involves?
Sure, and this is obviously a huge question. It could be its own seminar, but I thought what I would do is maybe just speak to a few concrete examples that have come out of both my own work and also just as I counsel people or mentor them around these kinds of practices. One of the first ones is a lovely segue from this conversation we were just having, which is about, you know, when does research begin? I think many of us are quite entranced by this idea of, you know, research ethics applications and that process, the administration of research ethics. And many ethics committees will really grapple with that concept of, you know, when do I need research ethics? When you know, how does that sit on this spectrum of activity, especially when we're engaging with people? So even determining, you know, do I need ethics clearance for some of the initial conversations I'm having with a potential group or a potential partner? You know, I often joke with people that it's like, oh, there's this moment where it happens and you go, oh, now I'm doing research. Wait, stop talking to me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So trying to really think holistically about what is it we're trying to do, what's the right point in time to seek ethics clearance. And often I'm saying to people, you know, go early, go big, ask all of those questions. And often you're trying to really capture an entire practice, not just a moment in time of data collection. But at the same time, you can't easily fit the range and the spectrum of activities into an ethics application or a single application. It may require multiple points in time along the way. So even just that practice is really important. The second point I'd highlight is really thinking concretely about settings that we work in that are going to require their own additional layers of ethical approval and review. One of the projects I was involved in Canada, for example, we were working with more than 30 hospitals across the entire country. And in the end, we had more than 10 different ethics forms and practices across those 30 plus settings. You can imagine the amount of time, energy, and people that were involved just in the management of that as a practice. And it probably took us in total about 18 months of the project. The entire project was meant to be 12 months, and the ethics clearances took 18 months. Obviously, the math does not add up. And part of that was because no one had really anticipated the roadblocks and some of the headaches and how that was going to fit in. The entire project was a multi-year project, so we were able to shift our timing. But things that look good on paper when you get a grant are very different in reality. So trying to think about how to navigate that, even with experienced researchers, is really challenging. The third one I would highlight today, and then I'll maybe open it up to my colleagues to comment, but I think the other piece is really thinking about Indigenous research as a practice, you know, doing some real work around the codes of ethics that are required and the ways to build relationship with Indigenous communities is critical. And I see a number of people who want to say do their PhD, they want to do some really great work with an Indigenous community, but they haven't actually built those relationships. They're not across some of the codes of ethics practice. this is also a very lengthy and deep and rich process of building that relationship. And many people kind of come into things and think at a very surface level about what that's going to look like. So I think in all of these three areas, thinking about what it means to engage externally, how that will sit with our own research practices that are the norm within a university, for example, or expected by a granting agency, and then thinking about where are the push points, where am I going to push back and stretch what might have been a traditional practice into some new areas because that fits better with the community's needs is really critical.
Thanks, Lisa. Rebecca, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in again because my research is with different kinds of partners. So like I said, I go and do the activity with the people that I'm researching. So I'm fully part of the project that I'm doing, which means that, you know, coming back to our last point, how we think about research as activism is really deeply ingrained in what I do, because I'm part of what's happening. So I'm part of the thing that I'm researching at the time. And in terms of ethics, then that's pretty big. My work's feminist too, and I work in male-dominated sports. Well, swimming's a bit different, but that's been nice. But there's other ethics. But in those spaces, you see all sorts of things going on that are really problematic, and you have to figure out what you're going to do. These aren't responsibilities that can come up on an institutional ethics form. They're ethics that you're navigating in the field while you're trying to sort of have conversations around practices, while you're trying to encourage cultural change so the space becomes more inclusive. And that's part of doing ethnographic work, is that you're in the culture, so you have these responsibilities to speak up at different situations, and it's not always clear when and how that's possible or safe for me to do. And so that, in terms of the ethics, the institutional ethics, which, you know, Lisa's talked about so brilliantly, that's all one thing, but the ethics when you're doing the research and you're in the field, that's not in a form, and that can't be clearly imagined until you're there. And some of that is really challenging, and in that way, then your research partners, or in this case, the swimmers and surfers, become really important people for you to bounce these conundrums off at the time, because you're working through those ethical issues with them in that moment. So in that way, again, because I'm feminist, because I'm in the cultures, it's always activist. You don't get much rest when you're doing this kind of research. So it's super fun. And, you know, I get to swim and surf and build relationships with these people, and, you know, really close, intimate relationships. But at the same time, I'm a researcher, and I have to keep these like weird boundaries in place, even though they're very blurred. So it's a really interesting kind of form of work, because, you know, like when does the project begin? I have no answer for that. Yeah. So the ethics in mine are the questions I always have. I find the institutional ethics forms kind of restful compared to what actually happens once I get going and I'm navigating it in the moment, in the field.
Thanks, Rebecca. Annette?
Yeah, I agree with what you both are saying, and I think I'd like to pick up on what you're saying, Rebecca, about the sort of institutional or regulatory ethics as being kind of a tiny bit of the larger scale of things that have to be considered. And I think that for me, and I've written about ethics for a number of years now, often when we think about ethics, especially from regulatory perspectives, we kind of encapsulate that as avoiding harm. But if we think more broadly about an impact model of ethics, or ethics as fundamentally related to our impact on the world, it becomes more centrally clear that science, and that is to say, me as a scientist, or academics in general, social scientists, are going to have impact at some point, whether large or small. And that opens up the possibility that we can see both sides of the issue. That on one side of the coin, of course, we want to avoid harm and avoid the egregious ethical errors that have been made. But often that has resulted in some in researchers, especially in researching contexts that are not easily explained or regulated, it makes it very difficult to act in those spaces. So actually avoiding harm can cause some kinds of paralysis. And if we flip that over, I mean, it allows us to see that we need to make impact. We are agents of change. We influence society. And if we acknowledge that we have impact, then we can open up a whole new box of, well, issues and challenges that are centrally about ethics, but take a perspective that goes well beyond the regulatory models. And of course, that doesn't make research easier, but it does, in some ways, help us know and maybe embrace the fact that ethics is about making decisions, right? There's no right answer, and there's never going to be only one right way of doing things, but that we make choices, and each of those choices has a direction, a critical consequence, and impact on societies and future knowledge structures and communities that we might be interacting with. So thinking of ethics from an impact orientation really, I think, opens up the possibilities that more things can count as ethics, but it also then it enables us to take on more of the responsibility and accountability for ourselves to make good ethical choices that will automatically go beyond the regulations.
Thanks, Annette. I might move on to the next question, and certainly if anyone has any questions they'd like to go back to anything that people have just mentioned, certainly put it in the chat. So my question is for Rebecca to begin with, about using social media and other digital tools for outreach with community. So you've had a lot of experience with this. If you could talk a little bit, I guess, about the benefits and the challenges, and maybe it might come back to some of the ethical issues that you've already talked about.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I use social media to connect with community a lot, and I use it in empirical ways, but and it's kind of through those empirical ways that I came to see how it could help me connect with community. And in part, that's because social media is this sort of, it's kind of like an everyday thing that people are holding in their hands. So they're engaging with it almost daily, and in quite intimate domestic ways as well. And the sports that I'm in are quite visual, so they're very active, participants very active on social media, and all sorts of participants. And on top of that, super interactive, and that's the bit that I think is really, and shareable. So once I sort of clocked all of these things over many, many years, I started to think about how that could help me. You know, it was already part of my research practice, was looking online, and I'd kind of like engaged with a few people, but I started blogging as a way to think through things and start to put some of my ideas out to a community. So you can see how long ago I started doing this stuff if I was blogging. Although I believe blogging's coming back. It's coming back. And now I use Instagram a lot because it's so visual, and that's the one that most people use in those sports across a range of ages and so on. It seems to be really popular. But what it allows me to do is to share my research ideas and findings with a broad community. I have no control over who's going to look at it. But it does also make me think about better ways to communicate research. So it's never fully removed from my journal articles and that kind of thing. It always starts with those. But it's then about how can I make, I don't know, Val Plumwood's eco-feminist ideas, you know, something that, how can I translate these? So it became this process of translation of research, and social media asks you to do it in quite succinct, simple ways, using an image or creating a quote on a tile or sharing someone else's work and framing it up somehow. So I found that really useful. And it also allowed me then, when we think about research as always having impact, as always being activist, even if that wasn't our intention, it's, you know, as you've said, and it's unavoidable, then I start to think about, well, if I'm a member of this community and I'm getting interaction on my content, then there's a requirement that I also engage. And so that's been difficult sometimes, but also one of the delightful things that's been super productive in then how your work will be shared, because you can't just passively post something and assume anyone's going to look at it. When you're on social media, you're part of a community, so you have to interact as well. And so that way I've been able to, I don't comment much anymore, but in the past, when I see really problematic stuff happening on surf magazines and things like that, I could intervene and I could speak up and say something directly to the author or to the community. And you have to pick your times when you do that, but it's been a really effective way of engaging with people. So yeah, it's really useful in that it challenges you to think about how else you can communicate your research in very simple, often visual ways, but it also it challenges you to think about how much you then have to interact with a community in return. And because I'm part of a community, I keep saying that on repeat, but it's really important because not everyone is in the way that I am. Then I have to think about, my responsibilities and in how I use social media as part of that.
Thanks, Rebecca. Lisa, do you want to comment on using social media? Because I know that you use it quite a lot in different ways from Rebecca.
I do. I do use it also as a site for data collection. So I've done some research around the use of social media by various communities. But as a researcher myself, I really do love both the community of practice concept and that you're building this network. And I love that it's just this serendipitous, you don't know who's out there, as Rebecca was saying. And some amazing opportunities have come my way that I would never have anticipated. So it might be something as simple as a journalist reaching out because they saw me tweet about something. And then, I literally had that happen once. I think I was ranting on a late Friday when everybody's really tired, and a journalist saw it and said, "Can I call you right now? I'm working on a story." And I thought, okay, what did I just put out there? I barely remembered. So, there are those little incidental things. There are people that I've actually worked with that I've never met in face-to-face, but when we do meet face-to-face, that's really exciting to meet your Twitter friends. So I think it does open up those opportunities. And for practitioners that I don't see in the other spaces that I'm in day by day, they don't come to conferences, for example, that would only be academic conferences. It does give them a window into your life, and they feel often that they can kind of reach out to you as a human being rather than just a face on the back of a book or on a website. So I think at some level, it really does that kind of leveling that I really like to see with different groups.
Thanks. Annette?
I don't have anything to add. I use social media, and I've been studying social media since the mid-1990s, long before it was called social media. And for all of the reasons that you mentioned and a lot of the techniques, I'm really quite active and happy with how it works. And so I do the things you do, and happy that you already covered it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I just add one more thing to build on what Lisa was saying too, is so my use of social media has also, in the same way that it's allowed you to connect with colleagues, it's allowed me to connect with, it's sort of built. So I started blogging, and then I wrote for a community surf magazine, and through that I write for mainstream magazines a lot more. And then I'm one of the ABC's swimming people now because they find me on there. So it kind of like allows you to exactly put your work out there, but it's that community building over time. So it's very slow, like you tick, tick, tick away at things. And I'm not trying to be an influencer. That's not my interest. So, but it does allow people to go and check. There's this really accessible, like with my Instagram account, people can look at that and get a sense of my swimming story and aesthetic and interest, so they can scroll through and see who I am. So it's a really good place to send like research participants who might want to check me out, and they can see what they might think of me in a way that's different to looking at a research profile. And that's been really great. And I also like to use it to amplify other people's really great work. So if I see really great work in women's surfing, like great projects, I can promote them. And so that's another nice thing that you can do is promote other good things that are happening in the community.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think from what all of you have said, it really illustrates it's really personal, but it's also something that you can just develop over time. And when people are cautious and nervous, it's not something you need to jump into, but definitely, you know, just adapt to your own personal research style and individual, you know, interests. So I might move on. Sorry.
Joann, I guess I do want to kind of add something.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a hurrah onto the rest of what's been said here. But if I think about the academics, the social scientists whose lives and careers have been transformed by their use of social media, I would say it is a foundational way to reach communities, and it's and to have influence, whether you call yourself an influencer or not. Some of the key people working in technology companies, for example, got hired by the technology companies, and we're talking Microsoft, the big five, Google, Facebook, you know, like they got hired because they had a presence through blogging and or early Twitter use. I mean, so and to advance the sort of academic orientation toward technology development, social media was fundamentally a way for academics to get into big companies. So you could look at any of them and see a trace back through social media of that being a way that people got their name out there, got their work recognized, they made their work more public. It watered it down a little bit for the academics who might critique them, but then they are now making impact at the level of policy and technology design and implementation at degrees that would be very difficult, especially for women, to have achieved in that length of time. So I'll just add that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, my next question is for you, Annette. So it's sort of in a similar stream. It's really about looking at how can we measure the success of our co-creational external engagement. And I guess that's just one of the successes, is where you obviously are working in an industry, you're making change, but you know, people use sort of types of engagement as a measure of, you know, when they're, you know, on the path to impact, and having sort of some metrics around that. But what else do you think is a good way of measuring the success of your co-production or your engagement activities?
You know, I find that a really difficult question to answer. And I haven't always been an academic. In fact, once I got to the rank of associate professor with tenure, I quit for 7 years, and came back to the academy because I love it, and I like doing research. But thinking about impact has never, or thinking about success is an odd, I don't know why I don't like answering this question very much. I mean, I guess for me, there's this kind of short-term success, and there's success for me, right? My success. And then there's success for the world in the long-term, bigger sense of success. So for me, if I think about the latter, where my success is measured externally by those people whose work, or who touch my work, or who my work reaches, research is a bit like teaching, I guess, in that sense, because in the classroom, for me, it's difficult to assess the success of my own pedagogical methods. I trust in the very small interventions, the spark in somebody's eyes, or the success of an individual student, and I have a trust that there's a chain effect, that my impact or intervention at this stage will have some chain reaction impact at some point. So there's this spread that is a common metaphor that I think about. There's a moment of intervention, and then somehow that spreads to some kind of larger social change. Sometimes it's not until 10 or 15 years later that anything I've written actually comes into play in the world. And and then I'm surprised. I'm like, wow, I can't believe that idea was taken up, you know, by others. So therefore, I think success for me is in the moment mostly, in this sort of sparking of an idea, or making some sort of impact or provocation through a participatory engagement. I mean, that small shock that might lead to change over time. There is then the other community of practice kind of success, which is what we've been talking about through social media. I mean, and ideally, one would hope that we have changes in policy or practices at larger scales. But I wonder what Lisa and Rebecca, and maybe even you, Joann, I wonder how you think about this question, because I find it not the most interesting question for me, for a particular reason. Like, that's not why I'm here. But I like having impact, and I like the idea of success. But how would we, you know, what does that mean?
I think it is a really interesting question, because I think the intrinsic motivation is what lots of researchers think about. But I know that universities and the government think about very different meanings of impact and why they're interested in success. So maybe I'll go to you, Lisa, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, and I share your discomfort, actually, Annette, and I think many social scientists, especially many qualitative researchers, do. And I think part of it is because we've seen what's happened on the academic impact tracking and measurement side, which is typically very reductionist, very much about numbers and citation counts and H-indexes, when no one actually understands exactly what an H-index means. You know, we do in information science because we created them, sorry. But you know, that idea that we're now going to turn our lens on societal impact and also potentially reduce it to a set of numbers or a bar graph, I think is very worrisome for a lot of people. And I think, like you know, I take my successes in the moment, and it's partly because of the types of methods that I use. You know, you can see it when the light bulb's going on. It's like teaching in a classroom, right? The same thing happens. And I might, through serendipity, find out about successes down the track, as you mentioned, and I am also surprised and thrilled and all of that. But the notion that we would then turn that into the machine of how do we then, you know, I'm going to chase these people down, I'm going to track it all, like, and what would that even mean? And you know, how do we make meaning of things is really right now the $1 million question. And it's because of those government pressures. But we've seen that, you know, in the UK ref, and even in our own engagement and impact exercise here in Australia, people still conflate engagement and impact. They don't quite know what impact means. You know, what does success look like? We're not sure. And this idea that that research and change is a linear process, I think, is at the heart of a lot of this. So I think for social scientists in particular, this is a space that we're going to have to really grapple with if we don't want inappropriate measurements to be imposed on the work that we do. And that's really my own concern as I look to see what the trends are globally.
Can I come back to that just for a second, Lisa, and pick up on something that you said? Because I was using this metaphor of the spread, and you were suggesting that this linear process is also a flawed process. And it really is interesting to me as I get older that I find myself circling around the same tiny question, same microscopic issue, right? That it comes back around and around. And there used to be this, you know, idea that, you know, any great author only has a single book in them, and they just keep writing they just keep writing more and more over and over again to try to get to that great idea, that one book, right? I don't know what the quote is, but that adage is actually quite interesting, because if we only circle around the same thing over and over, with that kind of depth is not that spread. It might lead to that spread, or it might be part of the spread, but there's this other side of I think what academic inquiry offers, that is this kind of rich depth orientation. And it's not necessarily in line with the way that viral media makes us think about how ideas are taken up, or the speed at which, you know, things get developed. I mean, that's so I think
or that all impact is positive, you know, and that's the right. And whereas we would want to look at negative impacts, anomalies. Why didn't someone take something up? And I've often said to people, well, okay, what if somebody adopts a thing and you go, yay, tick, I've had an impact. And then they later turn around and get rid of it because they realized it didn't work. You know, are you going to count that too? But really, we're just looking for the tick a box. And that's what makes me nervous.
I'll contribute, and I agree that looking for metrics for me isn't going to work, and I don't like it. And that, you know, anyway, but for me, it's like in things, it is coming back to what I've been talking about over and over, which is relationships, and seeing how things resonate across the relationships that I've taken time and care to build. And that can include within communities, so that people want to come and talk to you about something, or they're like, they've read something you wrote, or they heard about your work and they want to come and talk to you. So a lot of the impact I have isn't something that I can put in I can like quantify. It is all about things that have happened. So it becomes about telling stories. So a surf magazine editor will email me and ask my advice on a cover, or a school contacts me to ask my advice on a program they're developing for their PE curriculum, or a woman writes to me and said, I was so moved by this thing, when I read that, I didn't know anyone else felt this way. So for me, that's like really clear indications of impact, because if one person's telling you that, it's quite likely that that's more people feel that way. In terms of using like my social media stuff, that one of the blogs you shared, Making Friends with the Neighbours, which was about women surfing, I used to write essays on there, and they would get picked up years later. They'll get picked up, and they still do. Like, some of those essays have been published by multiple surf magazines, or, you know, action sports magazines. And so, you know, they're really worth producing, because I put it there. I don't know who's going to read it. Maybe no one reads it, but one person reads it, and then it gets amplified again. Like, it's that same thing as I try and share the good stuff. So when I see people sharing my stuff as stuff they think people should read in the surfing community or the swimming community, to me, that's really important. And seeing that the critical ideas I have, because all the social media work I do is completely framed in critical theory, seeing those ideas be like, I mean, I'm on podcast interviews now as well. You know, I got contacted by a bodyboarding group the other day to ask my feedback on this, like, comment that happened on a blog, right? It's these really weird cultural insider stuff. So for me, that in those terms, that impact's really profound, but it definitely can't be quantified. So what it means is I have to find a way of telling those stories really effectively for things like grant applications and job applications and so on. So it's learning to find a language to tell those stories. Yeah.
Thanks very much. My next question, I'm just conscious of time and hoping for questions. So I'll pop to Lisa now just to ask you, and maybe if we can have very briefer answers maybe to this question, then we'll maybe get some people to ask other questions. But Lisa, about the kind of time commitment, and I guess sometimes the resource commitment to doing engagement work. You know, for many academics, it's really about already being overworked. How do you really fit that work in, or juggle that, and maybe what priority does it have with the academic, I guess, priorities that you have?
I mean, I don't separate them, first of all, because I see that having an impact outside of academia is something that I've always done, just part of my DNA. But I think there are some concrete ways we can make life a bit easier on ourselves. And one of the ways that I do that, it comes back to, I don't see impact as a linear thing. So I actually try to build into a grant engagement and impact related activities as I go, so that it's not about me gathering data and waiting 3 years and then going up there, what can I bring to community? It's about, you know, every 3 months, every 6 months throughout the project, there are activities and pieces, and I'm consciously thinking about research and data collection and those elements alongside the what will this mean for this practice community, and trying to document those things as I go. So that's what I would say is multiple bang for your mental dollar, as it were. Trying to actually just layer things together will make this just part of how you work. Same with social media. People say to me, "Oh my God, it takes so much time. How do you do that?" And I say, "Well, if I'm on the tram, I'm on Twitter, you know, or when I'm waking up in the morning, I might be brushing my teeth and I'm reading things and I'm sharing them. You know, it's building it into your day so that it doesn't feel like an onerous extra piece."
Thanks, Lisa. I guess there's also the distraction element. I think particularly I find it a little bit distracting at times. I go down rabbit holes when I find people who are doing interesting work. So I guess there's also managing your time in that way when you're distractible. Rebecca, I guess it's a big part of how you do your research. So, you know, I guess you still need to, I guess, manage that sort of time commitment in lots of ways.
Yeah, it's definitely, as Lisa said, I build it into part of what my research practice is. But coming back, and so I won't expand on that. I try and make it a pleasure for myself, which it can't always be. I also try and make it not something that I'm obligated to. So I only put things when I want to. I don't have a schedule. I don't, like I said, I'm not trying to be an influencer. I'm not trying to have this like posting schedule or pattern that I do. So I don't follow the rules of social media, and I never have in that sense. But also to be aware of exactly, it can become time consuming and it can become a distraction, and it certainly does for me. And there's times when I have to like delete everything and take time out, because there is a real, although it's a work account, there's a real blurring of, you know, life and work and social media is just, it totally blurs that line for me. So it's, yeah, I definitely find that I have to be quite disciplined and strict with myself. Also because I use it as an empirical space that I'm studying, so it can become really consuming, and that's definitely something to take into consideration.
Annette, would you like to comment? I guess you've got quite a different perspective, having worked on it for such a long time in a maybe slightly different way.
Well, I actually would say that if I had to think about balance, I don't have any. I don't, right? Like, a lot of my work in the last 10 years has been for people outside of the academy. And so the research is a research as pedagogy. So trying to build citizen social science with communities through various kinds of engagement. And so I've done that, where the end point, the research and the research data that gets collected and generated through these engagements is often not for me, it's for them, and it's generated by them for their communities. And so I sacrifice my own ability to, or maybe an inclination to gather it. I mean, like I'm sitting on mountains of data that will never be published because it was never for that purpose. So my academic side will always suffer because I'm not using that as data for publications. And there's lines of books that could be written about it, but I don't. So I don't balance them, and I don't know if I ever will.
That's an amazing answer, because I've not heard a lot of academics ever say that. So that's because it all often it's the primary consideration for people. So yeah. We haven't got any questions in the chat, but I just want to encourage anyone who has got a question, if they want to raise your hand or put it in the chat. I do have one more question for the panel, but yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And there's no, you know, if you just want to ask on any aspect of really engaging for social change, you know, please go ahead. So my last question is to you, Rebecca, and I'll obviously get input from everyone, but what is the piece of advice that you'd give to HDR students who've not yet engaged outside the university, or I guess sort of the professional field they might have come from, who are really wanting to build connections for social change? And how do you start and really take that first step?
How I started was small and with great intention. So I knew exactly what I was doing and I had real clarity. So I started that blog, Making Friends with the Neighbours, and it was about women surfing, and that's all that blog's about. And so if I couldn't say that it was about that, I didn't post it. So I became very clear about what I was putting out there and what I wasn't. So it's to start with something you're comfortable with that's relevant to the community that you're trying to communicate with as well. That's really important. There's no point producing a podcast if listening to podcasts isn't something that happens in that community. It's no point using Instagram if Instagram is not what's used in that community. They use TikTok or they have a magazine or they make zines or something. So it's really about thinking what's relevant. And for me, it's also, and I would also say strongly that it's doing what is within your capacity. So, you know, especially if you're a HDR student, you're learning so much that's new. So if you don't want to learn how to make a film, don't make a film, you know. So I write, and I've always been a writer. So that was really accessible to me and really comfortable. I would say the addition of that so, you know, the important thing is that there's impact in the community. But personally, also what it helped me do was improve my writing skills. So I learned to write really well and with great clarity because these are short format. And then I did just want to get stuff out there. So I did sort of post a lot more in the past, and it really taught me to write and to write in a way where I would stand by what I was posting for a really long time. So yeah, I think it's got to be intentional, it has to be relevant, and it has to be something that is within your grasp. And after that, it's non-linear. So you don't know what happens after that. You can kind of expand from there. Yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I might just add, in terms of, you know, where you wrote, did you write for any other blogs before you sort of set up your own? Because there's sort of other kind of, you know, general academic blogs or blogs about sort of different issues that you can contribute to. I'm just thinking of things like the Research Whisperer, you know, that's sort of an area that, you know, lots of people, if they're hesitant about setting up their own thing, you know, is that something you've had experience with?
I mean, I started by just writing my own. It was in 2006. So it was just like, and I was just reading blogs like Marie Cardy's blog and things like that. So it was, you know, that's what was happening. And then I didn't tell anyone about it. So it was my own secret little space, even though it was public. And then slowly people found it, or I told people about it. So I could try a bunch of things out, and you can delete them because you can delete stuff, right? You can try it. If you don't like it, you'll know very quickly as soon as you press post if you want it to be out there or not. So no, I just had my own little thing, and it was very low stakes. It didn't matter. It was like a practice for me to try out, and then it's sort of built from there. Yeah.
Great. Lisa, would you like to comment on some advice for HDR students?
Yeah, I think, and I love what Rebecca said. I think that's fabulous advice. I think for me, it would be step back a minute and actually start to think about what your potential impact space is. I think a lot of students actually don't have an immediate, you know, line to who might benefit from my work. They may not even quite know that, or they think they do, and maybe that's not actually the right way to think or the right community. So I think actually finding space to workshop this a bit, it might be with your supervisors, or it might just be with other critical friends around you. But when I've had those conversations with people and I kind of say, well, do you see your work influencing policy, or is there a practice community that could take this up? Sometimes it's just a matter of some prompting questions to start to really understand who's a potential beneficiary. And once you know who could benefit from your work, then you can start to open doors. But I wouldn't start knocking on doors until I had a really clear sense of what I could offer.
Thanks, Lisa. Annette?
I guess I'll follow along after that, Lisa, to say, if I could give advice, I'd say, don't necessarily get stuck in the idea that you have to be or remain in the academic space, or that you have to buy into the metric-driven forms of evaluation that are characteristic in academic environments. Because there are a whole lot of places where a PhD matters and where one can work. I mean, I have been a reluctant academic my entire career, and I've, you know, for many years I was kind of an itinerant scholar. wandering around doing a PhD course here and there in the Nordic countries and scraping by. And I worked in a prison system and State Department in the United States. I have done all kinds of things outside the academic sphere, and I'm not even convinced now that I really want to stick around that long. But I'm saying there are lots of places that and ways that academic research and that research can get done. And I come from a field of internet studies where many of the people coming out with PhDs are making arguably much more impact in ethically strong and good social change kind of ways outside of the academic institutions. So don't be afraid to take that package of skills to other places and to think creatively about what a career might look like.
Thanks, Annette. We've only got 4 minutes left, and I have a question, and it might be too big a question to answer in 4 minutes, but I've often read about sort of the conflict of interest of people doing research for, organisations have specific ideas about what they want the impact to be, and I think Annette alluded to that sort of early on. And I guess, would any of you want to comment on just how do you manage engagement and sort of trying to sort of tackle an issue where maybe the participants or the funder or the partners have a very clear idea about what it is, but what you're producing is maybe critical or different. And how do you deal with that kind of tension in engagement? I'll open to anyone who wants to comment on that. So,
can I just really briefly mention that I have a lot of colleagues who are working in the tech industries, and they're working in ways for people that they would disagree with on very fundamental levels about technology. So people working for Facebook and trying to fight against their data gathering kind of principles. So it's I think that one of the strongest things I've seen is the maintenance of a community of practice, both inside and outside of the organization, and that has helped them understand the value of working from the inside, but also giving them some sort of maybe balance of, here's this toxic environment I'm working within, or for a stakeholder I don't respect on a large scale, and here's a community of practice who's supporting me and saying, keep going, you're doing good.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. Again, it could be an entire other session, I think. But for me, the academic integrity is really critical. And there's a reason that people come and talk to us and rely on our opinions. And it's partly because we'll call it like we see it, and we believe in the power of evidence. And we're not then easily swayed to some other agenda, potentially. But that's not to say that that is an easy road. And I think, as a former dean of research, I would say, it's even as simplistic as making, reading the fine print in those contracts with a partner and understanding what you're getting into, making sure you've got the freedom to actually publish, and that they are not going to have veto power over your results and things. I've certainly had cases, and I've counseled a lot of people where you've got results that the organization will not like to hear and will not want to share with stakeholders and the board and whomever. And understanding how to deliver those messages while respecting the partnership, but not selling out your own integrity is, it's a very challenging space, but really critical.
Thanks. Have you got a very brief answer, Rebecca, or comment that you'd like to make? We're just almost at time, I'm conscious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work with organizations. I work again with community, and for me, they're male dominated, and I'm talking about sexism in them. So I'm always trying to talk to those men and find a way to work with them, because often, like, you don't come across proper misogyny that often in, like, where it's real and like fundamental. So it's finding also ways to work with that, even when I find the sexism I'm encountering quite vile. But if they're willing to listen, then it's my job to have those conversations. Yeah, to a point.
Great. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I feel like we should have like a part 2, and it's great to have everyone here today. We will also have a recording, I believe, that will be made available. So I'd like to thank the panel members for speaking today, and for everyone who's joined us. So thank you very much.
And thanks to you, Joann.